Here's the building we're going to use for these 10 tips. My first tip is to have a good look at the overall shape and structure of the building. The shapes it's made out of, the proportions of the shapes to each other. There's a square tower at the front. It's divided into two sections which appear to be equal. There's a little dome tower on the top. There's 8 sides here. And there is a dome on top, and at the base these sides splay out. Behind the tower we have this box. Possibly the most important thing to notice is that the nave of the church doesn't sit behind the tower, it actually overlaps the tower, coming past the buttress. There are 7 windows or 7 window spaces down the side. There is a small entranceway, and the other thing to notice and to think about is there are all of these graves in the front. I want to be noting all of these things now so that when I come to draw, if I look at the tower, I also see that there is a buttress on each corner, and then this tall, narrow, arched window is actually recessed into that space. It's important to see these things early on, because that way, before I put pen to paper, it's going to be easier to actually see them when I'm referencing the photo to draw each line. My second point is to work out where eye level is and the perspective angles, to have a sense of how steep or shallow they might be. Now, eye level is the line that's level with the eyes of the person looking at the scene or the camera that took the photo, and it's the one place we get a horizontal line. So this line here is not horizontal, so that's not eye level. This line here is not horizontal, so it's not eye level. It's not just lines of the church, but it's any line which is horizontal. So obviously this isn't eye level. This line is sloping up, so it's not eye level. The line that follows the base of the windows slopes very slightly downwards, so it's not far from eye level. So eye level actually lines up with here, with the top of some recesses under the windows. And from memory, this makes sense because the ground was slightly higher where I was compared to the entrance of the church, and I was standing on a small wall that was around one of the graves. It's important to find eye level even when there is no actual horizontal line to draw, because above eye level all the perspective angles will slope with an ever increasing angle as they get higher and higher, and so this line up here is the greatest angle, and the same works for going the other direction. If we line up these lines, we can see that they do increase in angle, and there's the steepest line. So when I'm drawing these lines, I want to make sure that I don't draw them parallel to the line underneath, but that I increase the angle slightly if it's close to the line beneath it, or at a greater angle if it's further away. Now, under eye level, there are really no lines of the building to worry about, but we can see that these lines in the graves slope upwards towards eye level at increasing angles. So as I draw these graves, I want to make sure that this horizontal line angles at a greater and greater angle towards the bottom of the page. The third thing I'm looking for is what things can I see or not see from this angle. So for instance, I can see under the cornice here. I can see under the cornice up here. I can see under this eave. And these are all things which from further back I may not be able to see at all. These buttresses, I can see the side, the depth of the buttress on the right hand side here and here, but I can't see it on the left hand side. In the same way, I can see the depth of this long arched shape that's recessed for the window on the left hand side. I can't see it on the right hand side. The same happens down here with the recess for the door. On the right hand side of the tower, it's reverse. I see the depth of the buttresses on the left hand side of the towers, and I see the depth for the recess for the window on the right hand side. And it's the same for all of these windows here. When I look at the dome, I can see that even though it is actually a semicircle from a distance, from being this close, I only actually see quite a shallow section of the dome. The fourth thing that I'm considering now is something which, when I draw from a photo, I always need to consider, and that's the lens distortion. Basically, it means there's a vertical straight line right in front of us, which in this case was probably here, and then the vertical lines as we move to the left and the right angle more and more. It's like eye level and the perspective angles, but on its side. And while this is a perspective thing, vertical perspective, it's not happening here because the building is so tall and we're so close to it. It's happening here because the lens distorts what we're seeing. It pulls more of the surrounding view into the lens. I have to decide whether I'm going to draw it or correct it. And because from this distance with this view, all of these lines looked vertical, then I'm going to draw them in. My fifth point to consider before I draw is to look at the surface textures that I see on the various parts of this, and to be thinking about what ones am I going to try and draw, which ones am I going to leave out because they're just too fine and small. Now, the most obvious one to me are the bricks on the church, and while I can see them clearly enough in the photo, there is no way I can draw them this small. And one of my rules is that if I draw any bricks or stones, or draw some of them to suggest overall the stonework, I need to draw them at the right size for the proportions of the building, which is just impossible to do here. There are leaves at various distances, and I point out the various distances because the way I draw leaves will change a little bit depending on how close they are to me. And I've got the grass and I've got leaves and just little bits of detritus on the ground. So I have to work out how I'm going to represent those. The sixth thing I think about before I draw is simply how deep is my view? What's the distance between the closest and the furthest objects? So this gravestone here is probably the closest object, and I would basically put all of these gravestones and this tree in the foreground. In the midground, I would put the church and this tree. The far distance I would see is this tree and this little glimpse we get. And one of the things I need to think about is what size pen will I use to draw this. I usually choose between a combination of 2mm, 3mm and 5mm pens. Now, when I've done my line work, I intend to apply some tone to my drawing. And I'm going to use tone rather than hatching to represent shade, shadow and local colour. I'm going to use some Copic sketch markers, and I'll be using the brush end. Various shades of their neutral grey colour. So I'm looking at this to get a sense of how strong are the tones, where will I use tone? And while the brickwork certainly has a colour, I'm going to leave the brick that's in sunlight white, because I want to convey the sense of a really hot sun. And so the contrast between the hot sun and the areas in shade and shadow, I think will help to convey that. If you don't know the difference between shade and shadow, shade is what's on a part of an object that's turned away from the light so the light doesn't reach it. So for instance, this side of the tower and this side of the church are in shade because the sun's over here and so the light never reaches it. Shadow is where the light could reach it, except that something else is blocking the light from reaching those sections. So even though this front of the tower is in sun, this section up here is in shadow because this overhanging cornice is stopping the light from reaching this wall. Now this section here would be in sunlight, except that this tower is stopping the sun from reaching it. So although this is shade, this is shadow. In the same way, this is shade, but this is shadow. But this is shade. The reason why this is important to work out is because if we're applying tones, shadow is slightly darker than shade. And if we're using colour, shadow is slightly cooler than shade. Maybe it's more apparent in this black and white photo of the same scene. But can you see that this is slightly darker than this? That this wall here is actually darker than this wall and this wall. And that this wall here is darker than this wall. Now, local colour refers more to the actual colour of what we're looking at. So in this section here, this upper section is painted white, whereas the door is painted a dark brown. And when we look in the black and white, it's quite clear that the dark brown really is going to be a very dark tone in our finished drawing, not because of shade or shadow, but more because of its local colour. My eighth point is to consider how large am I doing my drawing? Am I going to draw it the same size as my reference? If I'm drawing from a photo, if I'm drawing from life, do I want to fill my whole page or do I want it just to take up half the page? Because having a strong sense of how large I want to draw it will help me work out what parts of the scene I'm going to draw in detail and what parts I'm going to suggest more or even leave out altogether. It's particularly important to have a sense of this when I start to draw, because those very first lines I draw will end up defining the proportions and therefore the overall size of my drawing. And my ninth point is, as it's getting close to actually putting pen on paper, what detail, what textures am I going to draw and how exactly am I going to draw them? So as I said, I'm not going to draw the bricks, but I do want to suggest the rows of shingles on this tower to give this wooden section a different feel to the brick tower beneath it. I'm really only going to suggest light and dark in this furthest tree with a very light line. This I think I'm going to represent more as a silhouette, whereas here I'm going to suggest individual leaves, hoping I don't make them too large and therefore change the scale of the tree. And with these gravestones and the railings around them, I'm only going to really suggest them rather than to get too exact with my drawing, particularly further back closer to the church. If I try and draw them all, I think it's going to look very cluttered. And the 10th tip comes after we've done the drawing. So now let me draw this, taking on board all the things that I've said. All of this time I've spent looking carefully, thinking of these questions and working them out before I put pen on paper. Means that when I put pen on paper, I will see these details in my reference faster and more accurately. And that will give me a much better chance of then drawing them more accurately. So here's my finished drawing. And I consciously used the 9 points we talked about, but my 10th point can't be done until we have the finished drawing. And that's to look at it and to look at our reference and to say, what do I like about what I've done? What do I think worked? And what things perhaps do I need to focus on more carefully next time? I like the way this foreground graveyard turned out, suggested rather than drawn in detail. I like the way these trees turned out. I like the way my marks here, without really drawing leaves, actually do suggest individual leaves, which does make this tree come much closer to us than, say, this tree, where I think my marks actually suggest foliage rather than leaves. What do I think I need to pay attention to next time? The thing I'm unhappiest is that this tower is a bit too wide. I think the height's are right, but it's just too wide. And it's not wide by very much, but it's just wider enough, I think, to turn what is a very elegant structure into something that, in terms of proportions from a distance, looks a lot more clunky, a lot more heavy-handed, which is a shame because this structure is clearly one of the highlights architecturally of the building. I'm thinking that this foreground may need a few slightly darker tones. And I think this just creates a nicer balance. If you're wondering, the actual drawing of this took just under 1 hour. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I hope these 10 tips are helpful, but more than that, I hope they're productive for you in your drawing. Don't underestimate their importance by the fact that they were all to do with careful observation and working out our process and our strategy for drawing. And I could have given an 11th point: choose carefully where we're going to start. Start in a spot where I can establish some part of my structure, or at least my scene, accurately most easily, because I'll be using that as a reference as I grow the rest of my scene around it. Whatever you're drawing, have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.